Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So today we'll be looking at a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya. So there was a request to look at the Ugga suttas, the suttas on Ugga, the householder. So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through the discourse and give some explanations, and then at the end I'll take any questions that you might have. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasāmi. So as mentioned, we'll be looking at the Ugga Suttas. So this is Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 8. And there's two suttas here about Ugga, the householder Ugga. So one is sutta number 21 and the other sutta number 22. And these two suttas are relatively similar to each other with a lot of overlapping content, but there's some slight differences. And I'd particularly like to focus on the second one, so sutta number 22, which is called the Dutya Ugga Sutta. So Dutya means the second. So this is the second sutta about Ugga, the second discourse about Ugga. This is notable because it's one of the very few suttas which talks much about the qualities of highly awakened lay people. So of course, most of the advanced practitioners that are spoken about in the suttas are monks, bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. There's a handful of stream enterer lay people that are mentioned in various places, and a very small number of non-returner lay people. So non-returner is someone who is one step short of full awakening. So they just have one step left to full awakening. And there's no mention in the suttas of arhat lay people. So when arhats are spoken about, they're always monastics, except for a couple peculiar cases where someone was on their way to become a monk and then died along the way. But that's a more complicated issue. But briefly speaking, the most highly attained lay people found in the suttas are non-returners. So the final stage of practice before becoming fully awakened. And this was the case with Ugga. So Ugga was a non-returner. So his practice was extremely advanced. So the discourse begins. So as usual, I'll be reading things in Pali and giving explanations. When relevant, I'll be explaining the meaning of some of the Pali words in more detail. Ekang samayang bhagavad vajji suviharati hattigame. So on this occasion, the Buddha was living among the Vajjis at Hattigama. So Hattigama literally means elephant village. So the place names in the Pali Suttas often have amusing literal meanings. Tatriko Bhagavad Bhikkhu Amantesi, so there the Buddha spoke to the monks. Atahi bhikkhave acharyehi abhutehi dhamme samannāgatang uggaṃ gahapating hattigamakang dhareta. So he says, monks, you should remember the 8 wonderful qualities of the householder Ugga, of Hattigama. So the householder Ugga who lives here in this village of Hattigama. Idama voce bhagava, this is what the Buddha said. Idang vatvana sugato uttayasana viharang pavasi. So after saying this, the Buddha got up from his seat and went into his dwelling. So this is the opening to the sutta. The Buddha just tells the monks, like, you should remember the 8 wonderful qualities of the householder Ugga. And then the Buddha leaves. And I find this quite amusing. There's a handful of suttas which start off in this manner, where the Buddha gives an extremely brief and somewhat cryptic remark and then leaves. And he just kind of leaves everybody else to try to figure out what he meant by that. So there's a number of suttas which start off in this way, and then it leads to the monks discussing what the Buddha said and trying to figure out what he meant, or sometimes they ask one of the other senior monks to give a teaching or an explanation, or something to give them a better understanding of the Buddha's statement. On this occasion, though, since it was about a person who was living in the village where the monks were staying, then the monks just went to ask that man himself. So the Buddha said, so the householder Ugga, who lives here in Hatigama, has 8 wonderful qualities. And the monks are like, well, we'll just go and ask Ugga. So it says, Atiko anyatro bhikkhu pubanha samyang navasetra patativirmadaya. So then a certain monk, dressed in the morning, took his bowl and robe, Yena Ugasa Gahapatino Hatigama Kasa Nivesanang Tenupasankami, and went to the house of Ugga the householder. So Ugga of Hatigama. Upasankamitra Panyate Asane Nasidi. And so having gone there, he sat on the designated seat. So it's quite common for Buddhist lay people to have seats ready for monks. So in case monks would come to visit their house, and they would very commonly be inviting monks to come. So inviting monks to their house to offer them food. So it's very common for people to prepare food and invite monks to come to their house to have the meal. And also inviting them to give Dhamma talks, or asking them to come so the lay people can ask questions about Dhamma. So it was very normal for Buddhist lay people to have monk seats prepared in their home, and to have areas in their house which are designated as where the monks would sit, where they could eat, where they could rest. And you still see this to this day in many Buddhist lay people's homes. They'll have supplies ready, set up ready for visiting monks. Some people will even have kutis in their backyards, like a cabin in their backyard for monks to stay in. So the monk goes and sits on the designated seat in Ugga's house, and it says, Atiko Uggo Gahapati Hatagamiko Yenaso Bhikkhu Tenu Upasankamitwa Tang Bhikkhung Abhivaditva Ekamantang Nasidi. So then Ugga went to that monk, bowed down to him, so paid respects, and sat to one side. And it says, when he was seated to one side, Ugga said to that monk, the monk said to Ugga, he said, householder, so the Buddha has said that you have 8 amazing qualities. And he asked, so householder, what are these 8 amazing qualities which the Buddha says you have? And Ugga replies, he replies saying, well, I don't know which 8 qualities the Buddha was referring to. But there are 8 wonderful qualities in me, which I can tell you if you listen and pay attention. I will speak. And I find this really cute, by the way, because again, usually in the suttas, almost always it's monks giving teachings to lay people. But there's a tiny handful of suttas where there are exceptionally advanced lay people who give teachings to monastics. And this is one of those extremely rare suttas. So yes, householder, the monk replies to Ugga. And Ugga says to the monk, he says, so in the sutta, he gives 8 great qualities. So this will be going in order. And that's why it's in Anguttara Nikaya chapter of the 8th. He says, Yirahang Bhante Nagavane Paricharanto Bhagavantang Patamang Durato Adasang So he says, when I was wandering in the elephant forest, when I first saw the Buddha from a distance, he says, Sahadasane neva me Bhante bhagavato chittang pasidi. He says, the moment I saw the Buddha in the distance, my mind was filled with faith. So just seeing the Buddha was enough to fill his mind with faith. Of course, these days we don't have the living Buddha around anymore. But there are people who they have no contact with Buddhism. They have no awareness of the Buddhist teachings. But then they go to a monastery or they're even just visiting a Buddhist country and they see a giant Buddha statue. So there's a very common sight in Buddhist countries. You can just be walking around and there's like a giant 100-foot tall Buddha statue just in the middle of the city or up on a hill. Sometimes even in non-Buddhist countries, you'll see these things, but especially in Buddhist places, you'll see it in many, many places. So some people, they just see a Buddha statue and they don't even know what it is, but something about it touches them very deeply. And it fills them with this deep urge to learn more. And they wind up investigating Buddhism and becoming a practitioner. Ugga had the great good karma to actually see a living Buddha himself. So Ugga saw the Buddha and it was immediately filled with faith. And this wasn't the case with everyone who saw the Buddha. So many people who saw the Buddha didn't even recognize that it was a Buddha. Just looked like an ordinary human being to them. Couldn't even tell the difference. Many people even had conversations with the Buddha and were not interested in what the Buddha was talking about or didn't understand what the Buddha was talking about. Or some people actually listened to the Buddha and understood, but then they weren't interested and they just went on and did whatever it is people do with their lives. And that's all of that is the result of one's past bad karma. If one encounters a Buddha and doesn't appreciate the Buddha and isn't interested in the Buddha's teachings, then that's because one's karmic affinity with Buddhism is weak. So one has enough good karma to meet the Buddha, but enough bad karma to not be interested. So it's a sign of weak affinity with the Dhamma. But Ugga clearly had strong affinity, so strong good karma associated with Buddhism. So he saw the Buddha and was filled with faith, and he says, Suramado chapahiyi. So suramado means alcoholic intoxication, and pahiyi means abandoned. So apparently Ugga was drunk when he saw the Buddha for the first time, which I find highly amusing. But he says the moment he saw the Buddha, his drunkenness vanished. Like his mind became extremely sober and lucid and clear the moment he saw the Buddha. And I don't think it's mentioned in the sutta, but from that, I think it's actually mentioned a bit later on. But from that point onward, he never drank alcohol again. So he saw the Buddha and his drunkenness dropped away, and he never used intoxicants again. And he says, Ayanko me Bhante patamo acharyo abuto dhammo sangvijiti. He says, this is the first of the great, wonderful qualities found in me. The second one, he says, Soko ahang Bhante pasana chitto bhagavantang pairupasing. He says, so with that mind filled with faith, I attended to the Buddha. So served the Buddha, honored the Buddha, looked after the Buddha. And it says, Tasame Bhagava Anupubin Katankatesi. And then the Buddha gave me the gradual teaching. So the gradual teaching is something that's mentioned in many suttas as being a step-by-step instruction that the Buddha would commonly give to people who are new to Buddhism. And last year, we had Bhante Sumita here who gave a series of Dhamma talks on the gradual teaching, the Anupubin Katang. So if you're interested in more detail, you can look up those Dhamma talks from last year. But here it just gives the brief overview, so the list of the categories. So Dana Katang means talk about generosity, about giving. It's the first topic the Buddha would talk about. He would talk about the importance of being generous, the value of being generous, the good karma that comes from giving things to other people. Second, you talk about sila katang. So sila is virtue, morality. So good, wholesome behaviors. So for example, not killing, not stealing, not cheating on one's partner, not telling lies, not using intoxicants, the basic 5 precepts. And Sagga Katang, he would talk about heaven. So talking about how through practicing generosity and virtue, then one can be reborn in a heavenly world. One can cultivate enough good karma that your next life will be extremely pleasant and joyful. And he would talk about kamanang adinavang okarang sankilesang. This means the drawbacks and dangers of sensuality. So the Buddha would talk about how it's dangerous to get wrapped up in sensual pursuits. There's no value to it. It just winds up dragging the mind into an increasingly dark and animalistic condition, a mind of constant suffering and confusion. And he would talk about nikkame anisangsang. So this means the blessings of renunciation, the blessings of non-attachment, of letting go. And it says, Yiramang Bhagava Anyasi Kala Chittang Muru Chittang Vinivarana Chittang Uddaga Chittang Pasana Chittang. So then when the Buddha saw that my mind was ready, when it was pliable, when it was unobstructed, when it was uplifted and faithful, Ataya Buddhanang Samukang Sikha Dhammadesana Tang Pakasesi. So then he taught that Dhamma teaching which is unique to Buddhas. So everything so far were things which you might hear in other spiritual traditions. But next, the Buddha gave him the teaching which is unique to Buddhas, which we only find in Buddhism. Dukkang, Samudayang, Nirodhang, Maggang. So that's the 4 noble truths. Dukkha is the first noble truth, the truth that everything is unsatisfying. Second is samudaya, that the origin of our dissatisfaction is our desires. Next is nirodha, that through letting go of our desires, then we also bring an end to our suffering. And magga means the path that leads to freedom from suffering, which is the Buddhist practice. And I find it interesting that although commonly when we're explaining Buddhism to people, we commonly start by explaining the 4 noble truths. When the Buddha was explaining Buddhism to people for the first time, he commonly would not start with the 4 noble truths. He would start by talking about generosity, morality, and heaven. Then he would talk about the dangers of sensuality and the blessings of renunciation. And only after he had established a foundation through talking about these topics, then he would start talking about the 4 noble truths. So I find this interesting that the Buddha would commonly start by talking about basic moral foundations before he would get anywhere near talking about more profound teachings. So this is a real emphasis on how Buddhist practice is grounded in morality. And morality is indispensable. It's not something which can be skipped over. And then he says, Sayatapi nama sudang vatang apagatakhalakang samadeva rajanang patiganheya. So he says, just as a clean and stainless cloth would easily take dye, Evam evam ko me tasming yeva asane virajang vitamalang dhammachakang udapadi. He says, in the same way, at that moment, on that very seat, then the stainless and pure vision of the Dhamma arose in me. Yang kinchi samudaya dhammang sabantang nirodha dhammang. So anything that has the nature to arise has the nature to cease. So this is the common way that one would say that one has attained stream entry. So having the pure vision of the Dhamma, that's one way that someone says they've attained stream entry, the first stage of awakening. And this direct vision that everything is impermanent. So everything has the nature of arising and ceasing. So nothing is permanent, nothing is stable, nothing is substantial, including whatever we think of as me. It also is not substantial, it's not quite real. And he says, Soko ahang Bhante, so then, Bhante, Ditta Dhammo, I saw the Dhamma. Hatta Dhammo, I attained the Dhamma, I reached the Dhamma. Vedita Dhammo, I understood the Dhamma. Prayogalha Dhammo, I was immersed in the Dhamma. Tina Vichikicho, I transcended doubt. Vigatakatang Kato, I had no more vacillation, no more confusion. Vesa Rajapato, I attained confidence. Aparapachayo, Satusasane, I no longer relied upon an external teacher. So these again are statements of a stream enterer. So a stream enterer directly sees and understands the Dhamma. So their mind is completely free of doubt, and they don't need instruction from an outside teacher because they've seen directly for themselves. They've seen the truth of the Buddha's teachings. And it says, Tateva Buddhancha Dhammancha Sanghancha Saranang Agamasi. So it says, right there, immediately, I took refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So he committed himself to the Buddhist practice immediately. Which is not surprising because one of the qualities of a stream enterer is that they have perfect, unshakable faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So it's natural that one would take refuge in the three immediately. And he says, Brahmacharya Panchamani Chastikapadani Samadhiyang. So in other words, he says he took the 5 precepts with celibacy as the 5th. In other words, he took the 5 precepts, but he decided to go a step farther. So ordinarily the 5 precepts are, so not killing, not stealing, not breaking trust in sexual relationships, not telling lies, and not using intoxicants. But he decided to go a step farther and also to practice complete celibacy. And this is natural for someone who has a deep understanding of the drawbacks of sensuality. It's natural that they will become interested in celibacy. Though for Buddhist lay people, celibacy is not expected. It's actually quite a lot to ask of anyone who isn't a monk. So this is one of the remarkable qualities of Ugga the householder, is that he decided to commit himself to celibacy even as a lay person. He says, this is the second wonderful quality of mine. And then he goes on, he says, Tasamai hung bante chataso komario pajapatio ahesong. He said, and at the time I had 4 young wives. So at that time and place in India, polygamy was common. It was socially acceptable. It was completely normal. So he had 4 young wives, and he went to his 4 wives. And keep in mind, at this point, he had just decided he was going to be celibate. So that makes things a little bit awkward when you have 4 wives. So he goes to his 4 young wives, and he says to them, he says, I've taken on the 5 precepts, and I've decided to be celibate. And he says, if you wish to, you can stay here, enjoying wealth and making merit. In other words, he's saying, like, although I'm celibate, I'm not going to kick you out. You can actually keep living in my house and using my wealth and enjoying the wealth that I have, if that's what you want to do. And he also says, Sikani va nyati kulani gachitu. He says, or if you want to, you can go back to your own families. In other words, he's saying, I'm not forcing you to stay here. If you want to go home to your families, you're welcome to go. And he says, Hotiva panapura sa dipayo kasavodami. He says, or if you want to go to another man, like if you want to have a different husband, I'll happily bring you to the husband of your choice. So kasavodami means like, who would you like to go to? So again, this is really lovely. This shows his mind of complete non-attachment. He had these 4 young wives, and he's just like, well, I'm going to be celibate, but whatever choice you make in your life, I'm going to support it. If you want to stay here and use my money and do whatever you want with it, well, that's fine. If you want to go home, well, I'll bring you home to your family. If you want a new husband, well, I'll help you get a new husband. So I find this really cute because it shows how compassionate he was to his wives. And it says, when this was said, the eldest wife said, well, give me to that man. So And it says then he brought her and he gave her to the man that she wanted. And he says, Kumaren ko panahang bante darang parichajanto nabijanami chittasa anyatantam. He says, and even when I was giving away my young wife, there was no alteration in my mind. In other words, he didn't have the slightest regret or disappointment or any, there was no disturbance in his mind. There was not the slightest bit of a sense of loss. He was just happy that he was able to help somebody out. And he says, this is the third wonderful quality in me. Next he says, Sangvijanti ko paname bante kule boga. He says, and my family is wealthy. Techiko aparivibatta silavantehi kalyanadamehi. And he says, and it is shared openly with virtuous people of good qualities. And he says, this is the fourth wonderful thing about me. So he's saying, I'm wealthy, but I don't withhold it. I openly share it with virtuous people. So he practices charity. So he has wealth, but he's not hoarding it to himself. He's always distributing it and sharing it with good people. And next, so that's the fourth wonderful quality. And the fifth one, he says, Yang ko panahang bante bikung payurupasami, sakachang yeva payurupasami no asakachang. He says, and when I attend to the monks, I do so respectfully, considerately, not disrespectfully or inconsiderately. So this word sakacha has the meaning of respectful, considerate, careful, attentively. So he's saying, when I go to look after the monks, I do so with consideration, respect, attentiveness, and carefulness. So really making an effort to look after them in a respectful and beneficial way. And he says, Soche me ayasma damang de seti, sakachang yeva sunomi no sakachang. And he says, and if the Venerable teaches Dhamma to me, then I listen respectfully, not without respect. And he says, Noche me so ayasma dhammang de seti. And if the monk does not teach me the Dhamma, ahamasa dhammang de semi. Then I teach him the Dhamma. And I find this really cute. So keeping in mind, this is someone who is almost fully awakened. And he says that if he goes to teach a monk, then if that monk teaches Dhamma, then he listens respectfully. But if the monk doesn't teach, so if the monk has something that he can learn, then he says, then I will instruct him. I'll give him some Dhamma teachings. So the implication here being is that even if he thinks that he has a higher attainment than the monk, he will still listen respectfully to the monk. And this is because, once again, of one of the characteristics of a stream enterer is this deep faith in the Sangha, this deep confidence in the Sangha, and therefore deep respect for the Sangha. So that's the fifth quality. Then the sixth one says when he has invited the Sangha, a deva, so a deva is a spirit or a celestial being or an angel, a deva will come to him and say, householder, that monk is liberated in both ways. That one is liberated through wisdom. So these are different kinds of arhants, fully awakened beings. Says that one is a body witness. That means someone who has extremely strong concentration, samadhi. That one is ditthipatto, means someone who's attained right view, so a stream enterer. That one is liberated by wisdom. That one is a Dhamma follower. That one is a faith follower. That one is virtuous, and that one is immoral. So in other words, when Ugga would invite a group of monks to a meal, then spirits and angels would come and tell Ugga like which ones were good monks and which ones were bad monks, which ones had high wisdom and which ones had low wisdom, which ones were fully awakened and which ones were partially awakened and which ones were nowhere even close to awakening. So Ugga would already know. He would already know which monks were better and which ones were not so good. However, he says, Sangham Kopanahang Bhante Parivasanto. He says, but when I was taking care of the Sangha, Nabijanami evang chittang upadento. I never once thought, Imasava tokang demi, Imasava bahukang. Said, I never once thought, I will give this one a little bit and that one a lot. He says, Atakwahang Bhante Samachit Dova Demi. He says, instead, I would give to all of them with an equal mind. In other words, even though he knew, like, this monk is better than that monk, this monk is more virtuous than that monk, this one is well behaved, that one is badly behaved, this one is wise, that one is foolish, even though he knew, and he also knew which ones were awakened and which ones were not, still he would give to all the monks equally. Without making any distinction among them. And he says, this is the sixth wonderful quality about me. And this is a very important point. So I still remember a story that my preceptor, Ajahn Pasano, would tell. So when he was a junior monk staying at Wat Pah in Thailand. And so people would come to Wat Pah to see Ajahn Chah. So Ajahn Chah was a very famous monk who was believed to be fully awakened. They would come to see Ajahn Chah and they would bring food to offer to Ajahn Chah in his monastery. And so Ajahn Pasano said, so one time he was staying at the monastery and Ajahn Chah was away. And at the time there wasn't much food around. So the monks didn't have that much to eat. And then some lay people arrived and it was like this big group of lay people and they had this huge truck full of food. They pulled up and they started unloading the food and starting to get it out and prepare it to offer it to the monks. And then one of them said, oh, so where's Ajahn Chah? And the resident monks were like, oh, he's not here. He's out traveling. And the lay people were like, oh. And they started loading all their food back into the truck and drove away. And this is exactly the opposite of what Ugga does. So Ugga is not like, well, I will only offer food if the enlightened monk is there. I will only offer food to the most respectable member of the Sangha. Instead, Ugga would equally support all of the Sangha members, regardless of who was better and who was worse. So this is one of the really remarkable qualities. I mean, actually, of all the really remarkable qualities about Ugga, this is one of the most noteworthy. That he would support all the Sangha members, all the monastics equally, even though he knew which one was better and which was worse. Then the seventh wonderful quality of Ugga, he says, sometimes devas would come to me and say, the Dhamma is well expounded by the Buddha. Tasvakato Bhagavata Dhammo. So the Dhamma is well expounded by the Buddha. And he says, Evang Hang Bhante Ta Devata Evang Videmi. He says, and this is said to me, then I would reply to that Deva, whether you say this to me or not, still, the Dhamma is well expounded by the Blessed One. So this also is cute, because normally what would you do if you're just hanging out one day and then angels come down out of the sky and they tell you like, the Dhamma has been well taught by the Buddha? You would be like, wow. Or you might think, I shouldn't have had those weird looking mushrooms. I don't know what you might think. But you might think like, oh, how amazing. Maybe there's something to this. But Ugga, because he's a stream enterer, actually he's a non-returner, but at this point we know he's at least a stream enterer. He already has an unshakable faith in the Dhamma through directly knowing it for himself. So when angels and spirits would come and tell him these things, he's like, well, I'm happy you know that, but whether you say it or not, it's already something that I know for myself. So he's saying he doesn't need external confirmation of these things. He already knows it within himself. And further, he says, Nakopanahang apijanami tatonidanang chittasa unnating. He says, and I don't remember there being any elevation of mind. So unnating means like an uplift or arrogance of mind. So he says, I don't remember there being any arrogance in my mind, thinking, oh, the spirits come to talk to me. The spirits come to me. So instead, for him, it was just normal. It was normal that he would sometimes have contact with these otherworldly beings. And then the next one, he says, Sacheko panahang Bhante bhagavata panamatarang kalang kareyang. He says, Bhante, when I die, if the Buddha explains my death, he says, Anacharyang ko panetang yangmang bhagava evang vyakarayang. It would not be surprising if this is what the Buddha said. He says, Natitang sang yojanang yena sangyuto ugogaha pati hatigamako puna imang lokang agacheya. There is no fetter by which Ugga would return to this world. In other words, he's saying that, he's telling the monks, he's saying, if I die now, then the Buddha would say that I will not be coming back to this world. In other words, he's indirectly stating that he's a non-returner at this point. And he says, this is the 8th wonderful quality that's found in me. And he says, these are the 8 wonderful qualities in me. But he says, I don't remember the Buddha ever saying that these are the 8 wonderful qualities found in me. And then it goes on. So then the monk took the food that was offered to him by Ugga and left. Then after his meal, he went to the Buddha, paid respects, and sat down. And he reported to the Buddha the conversation that he had had. And the Buddha replies, sadhu, sadhu, bhikkhu. So wonderful, wonderful. And he says, the way that Ugga explained it was correct. And he says, if you had asked me to explain it, this is how I would have said it. And he says, these are, in fact, the 8 wonderful qualities of Ugga that you should remember. So that's the end of the sutta. So at this time, we can pay respects to the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And at this time, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take your questions. So hello to Douglas, Jayanta, Vero, Vivian, S.A., Richard, Nana, Shimul, Usha, Matthias, Metta, Pavas, Yankee, Rick, Shadesh, Niranjan, Raman, Amaranta, Juliana, Sangtong, Sud, Leliati, Morgana, Venerable Khan Sarati, hello Bhante, Ja and Keith, so hello to everyone who's joining in. And I don't see any questions online. Any questions from the monastery residents on this discourse? No?
Can you spell Ugga?
Ugga. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't see any questions online or in person, so might be it for this morning. So we can go ahead and conclude the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. There is one question from online. So Richard asks, have you experienced any householders teaching monks recently? So it's extremely rare. And what I do know is on rare occasion, there'll be a lay person offering a retreat. And once in a very rare while, you'll see a monk showing up at one of those retreats. But usually it's just because they're looking for a retreat, not necessarily that they're looking for teachings from that particular person. To be perfectly honest, it's extremely hard to find a good lay teacher. I know lots and lots of amazingly wonderful teachers, but they're all monks. I don't know any amazing lay teachers. They might exist, and I've just never encountered them or heard about them, but I don't know of any. So I personally, I don't know of a single lay teacher that I would go to. I only know of monks that I would go to. Okay, so that's the end of the session for this morning. So you can join us again this evening at 7:30 for our evening Sangha discussion. And then again tomorrow for Sutta study in the morning and monk chat in the evening. So we'll see you all next time.